The vote was already halfway done when I walked into the chamber. I had been in the Galactic Conclave's observation gallery for 3 years by then, representing Earth as a junior diplomatic observer. I had sat through 612 sessions. I had listened to species argue about trade corridors, atmospheric rights, the ownership of dead moons. I had watched the Quorum of Efficiency block emergency food aid to a flooded colony world because the affected population had a low labor productivity score. I had swallowed my anger every single time and written careful, measured reports to send back home. But I had never seen anything like what was unfolding on the floor below me that morning. The main chamber of the conclave was built to hold representatives from 847 species. It was shaped like a spiral shell, widening from the central floor outward in ascending rings of seats. Some species sat in pressurized booths, others floated in liquid-filled pods. A few were simply projections, minds too vast or too fragile to travel in person. The light in the room shifted constantly to accommodate the visual spectrums of thousands of different types of eyes. I had one set of eyes, brown, human, and a prosthetic left arm that clicked softly whenever I moved my fingers. Because I had been born without the lower half of that limb, I used to hide it under long sleeves in my first month at the conclave. Then I stopped. No one here cared about my arm. They barely cared that I existed. The speaker at the central podium was a quorum delegate named Ven Soreth. I had met Ven Soreth twice at formal receptions. Both times, Ven Soreth had looked through me the way you look through a window when the view outside is not interesting. Ven Soreth's species, the Sorathi, were tall, trilaterally symmetric, and deeply convinced that the universe had been optimized for their benefit. Ven Soreth was presenting the final reading of Resolution 7 Omega 4, also called the Biological Optimization Directive. I had read the full text of that directive 14 times in the past month. I had sent copies to every government department on Earth. I had flagged it in 6 separate reports as a critical concern. Most of those reports had been acknowledged with a polite automated reply. The directive was written in the calm, bureaucratic language that the conclave preferred for all its ugliest ideas. It described what it called resource inefficiency within member species populations. It used phrases like consumption to contribution ratio and sustainable biological load. It proposed a framework, voluntary at first, then mandatory, after 2 annual cycles, requiring every member species to bring its population into what the quorum called productive alignment. What that meant, stripped of the formal language, was this. If a member of your species could not demonstrate economic or labor output above a minimum threshold, your species was required to remove them from your population count. They were not talking about retirement. They were not talking about care homes or pensions. They had a word for the process, a Sorathi administrative term that translated, approximately, as graceful reduction. I had read that phrase 14 times, and each time it felt like a door closing somewhere inside me. The vote counter on the main display was visible from the gallery. It updated in real time. The conclave used a tricolor system, gold for approval, gray for abstention, deep blue for rejection. As Ven Soreth finished the final reading and called for the vote, the board began to fill. Gold came first. It always came first when the quorum pushed something through. The Sorathi bloc voted immediately, followed by their 4 primary ally species, then the secondary allies, then the mid-tier members who had been quietly told that their trade agreements depended on their cooperation. The gold spread across the board like light spreading across a floor at dawn, and I sat in the gallery and watched it happen and could not move. I found our 2 seats on the display. Earth had 2 representative votes in the conclave, a consequence of our junior membership status. Both seats went deep blue within the first minute. Our delegates, Ambassador Carla Nowak and Deputy Envoy Desmond Obi, were the only 2 humans on the floor. I watched them hold their positions as the gold mounted around them. They did not flinch. I was proud of them in a way that made my throat feel tight. When the final count appeared, it read, 801 in favor, 46 against. The rest had chosen gray. I looked at the gray votes for a long time. There were hundreds of them. Species who knew exactly what the directive meant. Species who had enough power in the conclave to have swung the vote, if even a quarter of them had stood against it. They had chosen gray instead. They had looked at a motion to reduce other species' populations based on productivity metrics, and decided that their neutrality was more important than anyone else's survival. I wrote one word in my notebook: cowards. After the session ended, the gallery began to empty. Delegates filed out. Projections dissolved. Liquid pod species drifted toward their exit channels. The enormous chamber, so full of noise and movement minutes ago, became quiet with a speed that felt wrong. The way a place feels wrong after something terrible has just been agreed to formally. I sat there alone for a while. Then my communication device vibrated. It was a message from Ambassador Nowak. It said, "Call home when you can." I went to my assigned communications room and opened a channel to Earth. The light delay was just over 2 minutes each way. I had learned to live with that delay. You sent a message and then you waited, and then the answer came back, and in that gap you thought about everything you had not said. I called Maya. She appeared on the screen in the studio she kept in our parents' house in Lagos, the one with the high windows and the concrete floors that always had dust on them from whatever she was building. She was wearing the blue work shirt she always wore when she was in the middle of something. Her hands were pale with plaster. She was 41 years old and she had been deaf since before she was born. And she had spent those 41 years building sculptures that made people stop walking and just stand still and feel something they had not expected to feel that morning. I looked at her face on the screen, and I did not say anything. She looked at mine, and she did not sign anything. We just stayed like that, across 4.3 light years for a long time. Eventually, she tilted her head slightly to the left, the way she always did when she was asking a question without committing to words. Her eyes were steady and careful. I lifted my prosthetic hand and held it open toward the screen. It was not a sign. It was just a shape, an open hand. I did not know what else to do with it. She watched me for a moment. Then she reached forward and pressed her palm flat against her side of the screen. We held that for as long as the connection stayed clear. After I closed the channel, I sat in the communication room for another hour. Then I opened my journal and I wrote the sentence that I would later read aloud in the Global Assembly, in front of every head of state on Earth, as the opening line of my testimony. They did not vote to remove my sister. They voted to make us do it ourselves. That is worse. That has always been worse. I closed the journal. I looked at the wall. The conclave had given Earth 90 days to begin compliance procedures. 90 days. I spent the first 3 of them writing a report so detailed, so thoroughly documented, so impossible to skim or dismiss or file away politely, that it could not be acknowledged with an automated reply. I wrote it in plain language. I cited every historical parallel I could find. I named every species that had voted gold and described what their vote meant in language that was direct and specific, and left nothing for anyone to interpret charitably. Then I transmitted it to every government, every news organization, every academic institution, and every private citizen on Earth who had registered for conclave public communications. And then I booked the first available transport home. The galaxy had made its decision. Earth had not made ours yet. I landed in Abuja on a Tuesday morning, and by the time my transport touched the ground, the planet was already different. Not visually. From the air, Earth looked the same as it always did, green and blue and white clouded, impossibly beautiful against the dark, the kind of beautiful that made you understand why every species in the conclave that had ever seen a real image of it went slightly quiet. But the feeling on the ground was different. I had spent 3 years among aliens who moved with the calm certainty of civilizations that had been doing this for thousands of years, and I had forgotten what it felt like to be among humans when something had genuinely made them angry. Earth was angry. The protests had started within hours of the vote results reaching the planet, not the small, scattered kind that spring up when people feel helpless and want to do something, anything, with their hands. These were different. They were coordinated. They were loud in a way that had shape and direction to it. In Lagos, in London, in Karachi, in Sao Paulo, in Seoul, the streets filled with people who were not shouting in the general direction of the sky. They were shouting at the conclave. They were shouting at the member species that had voted gold. They had printed the names of those species, and they were holding them up. I watched the footage in the transit lounge while I waited for my connecting flight, and I felt something loosen in my chest, that had been tight for 3 years. Ambassador Nowak met me at the Abuja diplomatic terminal. She was a small, precise woman in her 60s. With white hair she kept very short, and eyes that had the look of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything, but had not stopped caring about everything. She had been in the conclave longer than I had. She had watched more votes. She had swallowed more anger. She did not say hello. She handed me a briefing document and said, "The Global Assembly has been called. Emergency session. 72 hours. All 193 member states?" I asked. "All of them," she said. "Some of them haven't spoken to each other since 2031. They're speaking now." I read the briefing document on the flight. It listed everything that had happened in the 72 hours since the vote results had reached Earth. 11 governments had already formally rejected the Biological Optimization Directive. 4 had issued statements condemning the quorum. 1 had recalled its cultural attaché from the nearest conclave relay station, in a gesture that was mostly symbolic but deeply satisfying. And then, buried near the bottom of the briefing in a paragraph written in the careful, understated language that diplomats use when they want to say something important, without making it look like they are excited about it, there was a name. Dr. Priya Anand. And below her name, a project title. The Perihelion Drive. I read the paragraph 3 times. Then I looked out the window of the transport at the clouds below, and I thought about what that paragraph meant if it was true. It meant that we had a way out. Not a metaphor, not a political way out or a diplomatic way out or a moral high ground way out. An actual, physical, leave the galaxy way out. I arrived at the Global Assembly Complex in Geneva on a Wednesday morning, and I had not slept in 22 hours, and I did not care. The main hall of the assembly was the largest indoor space I had ever been in on Earth, and I had been to the conclave chamber, which could have held 6 of it, but the conclave chamber had never felt as charged as this room did. The conclave chamber had the energy of old power being managed carefully. This room had the energy of something deciding what it was. Every seat was filled. I had never seen that before in a general session. There were translation earpieces at every station, and the low murmur of 193 languages mixing in the air above the seating floor made a sound like weather. I was called to testify on the second day. I walked to the central podium with my notes in my right hand and my prosthetic left hand at my side, and I did not apologize for either. I had rehearsed a measured, balanced opening, something diplomatic, something that acknowledged the complexity of the situation and the importance of careful deliberation. I did not use it. Instead, I read the line from my journal, the one about my sister. The room went very still. Then I put my notes on the podium and I talked about history. Not alien history, human history. I had spent the 3 days before my testimony compiling a list, and it was not a short list. I talked about every person in the documented record of human civilization who had lived with a disability and whose contribution to that civilization had been so significant that removing them from the count would have meant removing some of the things we were most proud of. I read names. I described what each person had made or discovered, or written or built or led or changed. The reading took 41 minutes. I did not rush it. By the time I was halfway through, the translator murmur had died completely. The room was absolutely silent, except for my voice, and the soft sound of the translation systems working in the earpieces of 193 delegations. When I finished, I said, "The quorum of efficiency has a formula for human value. I have just spent 41 minutes describing what their formula would have deleted. I am not going to tell this assembly what to decide. I am going to say that any decision which requires us to look at a list like the one I just read and call those lives a net deficit is not a decision. It is a failure wearing the clothes of a decision." I stepped back from the podium. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then it broke, and what replaced it was not polite applause. It was the kind of noise that has too much feeling in it to be called applause. It was something louder, and less organized, and far more honest. I sat down and I pressed my hands flat on the table in front of me, both of them, and I breathed. 2 hours later, a decorated general named Arthur Bligh took the podium. General Bligh had lost both legs below the knee during the Martian colony crisis of 2047. He walked on prosthetics that were considerably less refined than my arm. And he walked with a cane, and he walked to that podium with the particular kind of slow dignity that belongs to people who have decided that the way they move is not something they owe anyone an apology for. He argued for compliance, not with enthusiasm. His voice carried the particular exhaustion of a man saying something he felt he had to say, rather than something he wanted to say. He described the military and strategic impossibility of resisting a conclave enforcement action. He described what the Alliance fleets could do to Earth's orbital infrastructure. He described timelines and casualty projections. He was not wrong about any of the numbers. He was interrupted before he finished. Not by me, not by Ambassador Nowak. He was interrupted by a block of 14 delegates who rose simultaneously from different sections of the floor. 14 decorated veterans from 14 different nations. Some were in wheelchairs. One was blind and had a guide, a young man who sat beside him with a hand on his arm. Several were missing limbs. One was an older woman named Colonel Diane Marsh, who had a traumatic brain injury that had changed the way she spoke, slowly, with long pauses, but had not changed what she said. Colonel Marsh spoke first. She spoke slowly, and she spoke clearly, and she said, "We did not survive what we survived to be erased by a number on a productivity ledger. We are not asking permission. We are telling you what we are willing to defend." The room did not explode. It absorbed what she said the way water absorbs something dropped into it, with a ripple that moved outward in every direction at once. General Bly looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the podium and sat down. He did not speak again during the session. It was after the veteran block sat down that someone raised the name Priya Anand again, and this time it was not buried in a briefing document. It was said aloud in the chamber, and a side door opened, and a small woman in her late 40s walked to the podium rolling a manual wheelchair alongside her, which she used when her joints were bad, and today they were bad, and she gripped the edges of the podium with both hands and looked out at 193 delegations and said, "I need 8 more months. I have been building something in the Thar Desert for 14 years. If you give me 8 more months and buy me the time I need, I can take every living person on this planet somewhere the quorum of efficiency will never reach." The room was silent again. Someone asked, "Where?" Priya Anand looked at the person who had asked. Then she looked at the room. "Out," she said. That was when I understood that we were not going to fight the conclave. We were not going to negotiate with it, or reform it, or wait for it to reconsider. We were going to do something that no species in recorded galactic history had ever done before. We were going to leave. The vote of the Global Assembly took place on the evening of the 3rd day. 193 member nations. The question on the floor was not complex. It did not use diplomatic language or careful framing. It had been written by a 26-year-old staffer from the New Zealand delegation who had apparently decided that after 3 days of extraordinary speeches, the vote question should match the moment. It said, "Does Earth reject the Biological Optimization Directive and choose the path of full independent departure from the Galactic Conclave in accordance with the principles proposed by Dr. Priya Anand?" 189 nations voted yes. 4 abstained. 0 voted no. The 4 who abstained were not celebrated for their neutrality. The Assembly Secretary read their abstentions into the record with the same flat voice she used for everything, and the 4 delegates who had abstained sat very still in their seats and looked at the table in front of them. I watched them from across the room. I thought about the gray votes on the conclave board. I thought about how neutrality feels like safety from the inside and looks like something else entirely from the outside. I wrote their names in my journal too. After the vote, I sat in the nearly empty hall and called Maya. She appeared on screen still in her studio, still in the blue work shirt, but the plaster on her hands was dry now, and she had clearly not moved much since we last spoke. She had been watching the assembly proceedings on a live broadcast. I said, "We voted." She signed back, quick and certain, one of the signs she had invented herself as a child. A closed fist opening wide, fingers spreading outward, like something releasing into the air. I knew what it meant. She had always used it for the same thing. We decided. I nodded at the screen. Then I closed the channel, and I went to find Priya Anand, because we had 8 months and not a single hour to waste. The first thing Priya Anand said to me when I found her in the corridor outside the assembly hall was, "You have a prosthetic. What generation?" I held up my arm. Fourth. Why? She looked at it with the focused attention of someone cataloging information. We are designing the habitat ships for full accessibility from the structural level up. I need someone on the planning team who understands assistive integration from personal experience, not just from reading about it. Are you interested? I said yes before she finished the sentence. That was how I spent the next 8 months. The project already had a name, Perihelion, and it already had a facility, a sprawling underground complex in the Thar Desert that had officially been registered as a geological research station for the past 12 years. It already had a team of over 300 scientists, engineers, medical specialists, and systems designers. What it needed now was urgency and scale, because Priya had been working under the assumption that she had years left before she would need to deploy. The assembly vote had changed that timeline by a significant amount. She showed me the core of it on my first day at the facility, a fold space engine design that she had spent 14 years refining, based on a theoretical framework that 3 separate conclave-affiliated research bodies had independently declared impossible. The conclave's science apparatus had published dismissals of her work twice. She had saved both dismissals and pinned them above her primary workstation, which I thought said everything you needed to know about her. The mathematics are correct, she told me, standing at the workstation with a stylus in her hand and equations covering every surface around her. The Sarathi declared it impossible, because their models assume certain constants that are only constant within the Milky Way's gravitational frame. They never considered that someone might want to go somewhere the constants are different. And you did, I said. I had reasons to want out, she said. She said it simply, the way you say something that is deeply true, and you have made your peace with. She did not explain further, and I did not ask. Her team was unlike any group I had ever worked with. About 40% of them were autistic. Many of the others had conditions that the conclave's productivity metrics would have flagged immediately. There was a brilliant propulsion specialist named George Nkosi, who communicated primarily through a text interface, and whose solutions to fuel distribution problems were so elegant that the rest of the team had started printing them and putting them on the wall. There was a structural engineer named Faye Okonkwo, who worked from a hospital bed for 3 of the 8 months because her condition required it, and who designed the load-bearing framework for the primary habitat vessels during that time. There was a young atmospheric chemist named Liam Draper, who needed to take several long breaks each day, and who had solved the air cycling problem for enclosed generational habitats during one of those breaks, apparently because the quiet helped him think. I stopped being surprised by any of it after the first month. I started writing it all down instead. My specific role was the accessibility integration team, which meant working with designers and engineers to ensure that the habitat ships were not accessible as an afterthought, a ramp added here, a wider door bolted on there, but accessible as a fundamental design principle. Every corridor built at 2 widths, every interface system with multiple input modes, every medical bay designed by people who understood from personal experience what it meant to need one. We had people with every kind of body and mind on that design team, and the ships we were building reflected all of them. Meanwhile, I was still going to work. That was the other side of those 8 months, the part that required a different kind of effort entirely. I was still Earth's lead diplomatic observer at the conclave. I was still sitting in that chamber. I was still attending sessions and submitting procedural filings and shaking hands, or the alien equivalent, with delegates who had voted for the directive that was making us build an escape fleet in the Thar Desert. The official position was that Earth was in compliance review. This was true in the technical sense that we had not formally notified the conclave of our rejection. The global assembly vote was not public. The Perihelion project was classified. Earth had submitted a request for a compliance extension on the grounds of cultural and administrative processing requirements, and the quorum had granted 60 additional days while making it very clear that they found the request tedious. I was the one who had submitted that request. I had written it with the specific goal of being as tedious as possible, dense with procedural citations, full of requests for clarifying documentation, carefully designed to generate the maximum amount of bureaucratic friction while technically saying nothing that was untrue. It worked. The quorum found it annoying. Their annoyance made them slower. Their slowness gave us time. Every day I bought at that podium was another day for Priya's team in the desert. After the first 60 days expired, I filed another extension request. This one was even longer. I cited 17 different precedents. I requested formal definitions of 4 key terms in the directive. I raised a procedural challenge to the vote record that required a committee review. The committee review took 3 weeks to convene, and another 2 weeks to resolve. In the quorum's favor, obviously, but that was 5 weeks. Ven Soreth looked at me differently after the second extension. The looking through a window expression was gone. There was something else there now. Not quite respect. Something more cautious than that. I had been a minor inconvenience before. I was becoming something slightly harder to categorize, and beings like Ven Soreth did not like things they could not categorize. I did not mind. What I did mind was the surveillance. In the 4th month, our monitoring team detected a set of observation drones entering Earth orbit. They were not military. They were not armed. They were the Conclave's standard compliance monitoring array, the kind deployed to member worlds suspected of non-cooperation. They were small and numerous and very difficult to track individually. The first response from some members of our planning team was to remove them. I argued against that. Removing the drones would confirm that we had something to hide. Instead, I worked with a small team, including a quietly brilliant young intelligence specialist named Sophie Farron, who had an anxiety disorder that meant she thought about problems from 15 different angles at once and could not stop thinking about them, which made her exceptionally good at her job, to figure out what the drones could see and what we could show them. What they could see was the surface of Earth, specifically urban areas, public gathering spaces, and government facilities. They could detect population movement patterns. They could observe large-scale public events. So we gave them a show. We began holding what looked like compliance registration events, large public gatherings organized through city administrations, where people came and submitted forms and were assigned numbers. From orbit, the pattern looked exactly like the kind of preliminary population documentation that a species beginning compliance procedures would generate. It was actually the most comprehensive census we had ever conducted, designed specifically to create the manifest lists we would need for the Exodus fleet. Every person on Earth was registered, their needs documented, their location recorded, their place on the departure schedule confirmed. We called it Project Archive, and we ran it in full view of the Conclave's surveillance drones, and they saw exactly what we wanted them to see. 3 months before we were ready, the crisis nearly came apart. A journalist named Owen Hart had been investigating the perihelion project for several weeks. He had good sources and a sharp mind, and he had assembled a partial picture that was accurate enough to be dangerous. He published a story under the headline, Earth's Secret Starship, What is the Government Building in the Desert? The story did not reach the Conclave immediately. The transmission lag gave us approximately 14 hours. In those 14 hours, I worked with Ambassador Nowak, Sophie Farron, and 2 members of Priya's team to construct what might have been the most audacious diplomatic maneuver in human history. I requested an emergency floor session at the Conclave. I stood at the central podium, and I told the assembled delegates of 847 species that Earth had been conducting a classified advanced propulsion test in our desert region, that the journalist's story had revealed information related to an Earth defense initiative, and that we were formally requesting that the Conclave respect the military testing privacy provisions under Article 44 of the membership charter. The key word was military. The quorum immediately became very interested in Earth's military capabilities. This was not the reaction I had hoped for, but it was the reaction I had planned for. Ven Soreth's faction began requesting clarifying documents about the nature of the propulsion system, the exact documents I had already prepared, which described a weapons delivery mechanism with technical specifications that were completely plausible and completely fictional. Sophie had written most of it. She had once told me that her anxiety made her excellent at imagining worst cases, and it turned out that ability also made her excellent at inventing them. The quorum received the documents. They consulted their own technical advisors. Those advisors concluded that what Earth appeared to be building was a significant but not unprecedented weapons platform. The Conclave issued a formal note of concern and scheduled a review session for 8 weeks later. 8 weeks was more than enough. 2 weeks after the near crisis, something happened that I had not anticipated and had not dared to hope for. 3 species approached me separately, in private, through channels that were deliberately difficult to trace. The first was a delegate from the Veth Collective, a species of small, fast-moving creatures who communicated through rapid color shifts across their outer membranes. The Veth had voted gray on Resolution 7 Omega 4. I had written the word cowards next to their species name in my notebook. The delegate who met me was named something I could not pronounce in Veth, so they had given me a name to use: Marin. Marin told me that approximately a third of all Veth were born with genetic variations that affected their membrane control, making their communication less precise. The Veth had been hiding this from the Conclave for 200 years. When the directive passed, Marin's collective had a very long internal discussion, and then Marin had been sent to find me. "We cannot vote against the quorum openly," Marin said, through a translation device held between us. "They would investigate. They would find what we have been concealing. We would face something worse than a directive, but we can help you quietly." I erased the word cowards from next to the Veth entry in my notebook. I wrote something else instead. The second approach came from a species called the Korathi, who had voted against the directive in the original ballot, and whose 2 delegates I had nodded to once without ever learning anything about them beyond their names. They were grief-shaped beings. I mean that literally, in that their physical form communicated emotional state, and the 2 Chorathi delegates I met looked like beings who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. They told me they had lost their most celebrated artists, musicians, and writers in a quorum-aligned efficiency review 200 years ago. The Chorathi cultural record had a gap in it now, a 2-century silence, and they had been grieving it ever since. They had voted against the directive not out of strategy but out of memory. The third approach was the strangest. It came through a written message left on my communication device, unsigned, in a language that took Sophie's team 4 days to decode. It was from a species that had no commonly agreed name in Conclave records. They were simply logged as Designation 7 Hive, because the Conclave had found their form of communication too slow and complex to categorize properly, and had placed them in observer status rather than full membership. They communicated in patterns that took days to complete. The Conclave had classified this as a cognitive limitation. The message, once decoded, offered material support. It also said, in the patient, layered way of a species that took its time with everything, "We have been watching you for 9 of your years. You are the first species in this assembly that has ever asked what we were trying to say." I read that message 3 times and felt something I could not name and did not try to. Priya's team got the signal at 4:17 in the morning on a Thursday in the 6th month. I was in the desert facility, asleep on a cot in one of the equipment rooms, when George Nkosi woke me by opening the door and standing in the light from the corridor and saying, very quietly, "It worked." The first successful fold test. An unmanned probe the size of a small transport vehicle had entered the fold space corridor generated by the perihelion engine and emerged 9 seconds later in intergalactic space, beyond the Milky Way, beyond the gravitational frame, beyond the reach of the Conclave's longest-range detection systems. It had transmitted its location data back and then returned to its launch point. 9 seconds. For 9 seconds, a human-made object had existed somewhere no species in recorded galactic history had ever sent anything. I went to the main lab where most of the team had gathered. Faye Okonkwo was on a video feed from her hospital room. Liam Draper was sitting in the corner with his knees pulled up and his eyes very wide and very bright. George Nkosi was standing completely still in front of the confirmation data on the wall display with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Priya was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and her eyes closed, her hands loose in her lap. I sat down on the floor next to her. "How much longer do you need?" I asked. She did not open her eyes. 2 months for full fleet capability. 6 weeks if we push hard. Push hard, I said. She nodded, eyes still closed. Around us, the team was beginning to make noise, not celebrating loudly. That was not the register of this group, but talking, moving, pulling up secondary data, already working on the next phase. Someone had brought tea from the kitchen and was passing it around. Faye's voice came through the video feed from her hospital room, clear and precise, asking a technical question about fold corridor stability, and 3 people answered her simultaneously and started arguing productively. I watched them for a while. Then I opened my journal and I wrote, The galaxy thinks we are afraid. We are, but fear and surrender are not the same word, and they keep confusing the two. I closed the journal. I drank my tea, and I went back to work. The enforcement fleet arrived on a Friday. I know it was a Friday, because I had been counting days for the past 3 weeks, with the specific awareness of someone who knows a clock is running and needs it to run just a little longer. Friday was day 238 since the Global Assembly vote. It was 11 days after the last extension I had filed with the conclave had formally expired. It was 9 days after Priya had told me the fleet was ready. The Quorum's enforcement fleet consisted of 220 vessels. They entered Earth's orbital approach on a standard compliance enforcement trajectory. Slow, visible, deliberate, designed to be seen rather than to surprise. The conclave always announced its enforcement actions. It believed that the announcement was itself the power. Show enough ships in orbit, and the species below would look up, calculate their odds, and do what they were told. That calculation required one specific assumption to be true. It required the species below to have nowhere else to go. I was in the conclave chamber for the last time when the fleet launched. I had been there for the morning session, sitting in the observer gallery as I always did, watching the ordinary business of the conclave proceed. Trade agreements, border definitions, the unremarkable administration of a galaxy that had been doing this for so long, it had stopped noticing the weight of it. When the session ended, I did not go to my diplomatic quarters. I did not go to the communications room to send a report. I walked to the floor of the chamber, the first time I had ever stood on the floor rather than watching from the gallery, and I approached the central registration desk and I formally requested the floor. There was a pause. Junior observers did not take the floor. There was no rule against it, technically, but it was not done. The desk officer, a quiet species called the Arathi who handled conclave administration with the patient thoroughness of beings who had been doing paperwork for 10,000 years, checked the membership charter, confirmed that Earth had not yet formally withdrawn, and granted the request. I walked to the central podium. The chamber was mostly empty at this hour. 50, perhaps 60 delegates remained from the morning session, plus the administrative staff. Ven Sorath was not among them. I had not expected Ven Sorath to be. This was not a session that had been announced, but the record was open. Everything said on this floor was recorded and archived and transmitted across every conclave relay station in the galaxy. I looked at the 50 delegates in the room. I thought about the hundreds who were not there, the gray votes, the abstentions, the species who had calculated their neutrality and chosen it over everything else. I addressed them all. I said, Earth is withdrawing from the Galactic Conclave, effective immediately, under the voluntary departure provisions of Article 12, Subsection 7 of the Membership Charter, which has not been invoked since the Conclave's founding, and which we have now invoked. The formal documentation has been filed with the Administrative Registry as of this morning. I looked at the 50 faces in the room, or the 50 approximations of faces. I want to name the species that voted against Resolution 7 Omega 4, I said. There were 46 of them. Their names are in the record and I am reading them now not to embarrass them but because they chose correctly and that should be remembered. I read all 46 names. It took 12 minutes. I want to also name the species that chose gray, I said. I am not going to read all of them. I am going to say that their abstentions are also in the record, and that the beings who will be affected by what Resolution 7 Omega 4 permits, not on Earth, because we are leaving, but in the member species that remain, will know who stood and who did not. I paused. To the Quorum of Efficiency, I said, I want to say this. You built a framework for measuring the value of a life, and you called it optimization, and you believed it was science. It is not science. It is a choice, a very old and very specific choice, dressed up in the language of mathematics, to make it feel inevitable. It is not inevitable. We are proof of that. We are choosing something different. I looked down at the podium surface for a moment. You believe that production gives life its value. We believe that life gives production its meaning. We are not the same. We tried, for 30 years, to find common ground between those two beliefs, and we could not, because they are not different points on the same line. They are different lines entirely. You go one way, we are going another. I stepped back from the podium. I said, formally, for the record, Earth thanks the Galactic Conclave for the years of membership. "We are leaving now." I walked off the floor. By that time, the exodus had been underway for 12 days. It had not looked like an evacuation. Priya had been very specific about that. She had said, early in the planning stages, that the departure of Earth's entire population should not look like running. It should look like what it was, a civilization making a decision and carrying it out with the full dignity of a people who knew exactly what they were choosing and why. The fleet was 2,417 vessels. They ranged from massive habitat ships, each one a self-contained world capable of supporting 500,000 people, to smaller support craft, agricultural vessels, medical ships, research platforms. Every ship had been given a name. Not military names, not names of weapons or battles or conquest. The naming committee, which had been one of the stranger and more wonderful subgroups I had worked with during the 8 months, had compiled a list from every culture on Earth, focusing specifically on the people that the conclave's productivity metrics would have flagged. The ships were named for people who had built and made and written and led and discovered and changed things, and who had done all of it while living in bodies and minds that other people, at various points in history, had tried to define as less. The largest ship was named for Maya. Not my sister, another Maya. But I had noticed when the list was published, and I had not said anything to Maya when we spoke, and she had not mentioned it either, but she had given me that look she had, the tilted head, the steady eyes, and I knew she had seen it. The population boarding had taken 8 days, and had been organized with a precision that I still find remarkable when I think about it. Every person on Earth had a boarding time, a vessel assignment, a seat number. Every accessibility need had been documented and matched to the appropriate ship design. Every medical condition had been cross-referenced against the medical facilities on board. The census that had looked like compliance registration from orbit had been, underneath, the most thorough departure logistics operation ever attempted by any species, anywhere, in recorded history. I was one of the last to board. I walked across the surface of the Earth at the primary departure site in the Thar Desert, not far from where the perihelion engine had been built, at dawn on the final day. The desert was quiet. The sky above was very clear and very blue, shading to black at the edges where the atmosphere thinned. I could see 3 of the habitat ships still in low orbit, their silhouettes enormous and steady. I had spent the morning walking through the facility, not checking anything. Everything had been checked. I had just walked through it. The workstations where Priya's team had built the impossible thing. The equipment room where I had slept on the cot. The main lab where we had sat on the floor together and listened to the team talk through the night. Clean, quiet, ready. Earth was not being abandoned. Priya had been very clear about that as well. The biomes had been tended. The infrastructure had been maintained. The atmosphere processors had been set to self-sustaining cycles. The planet would be fine without us. It had been fine before us for an extremely long time. We were leaving it in good condition, the way a considerate guest leaves a room. I boarded my assigned vessel, a mid-size research and diplomatic ship named Constance, at 0600 hours. 3 hours later, I was on the observation deck when the enforcement fleet arrived in orbit. I watched them on the long-range display, 220 ships, holding their standard compliance approach formation, which was designed to be visible and to be understood as a message. They completed their orbital insertion. Their sensors would have begun scanning for human life signs immediately. They would have found none on the surface. They would have found all of us in orbit, already departing. The fleet's lead vessel attempted to hail us. The hail came through on the emergency channel, the one reserved for distress signals and official warnings. The fleet commander identified herself as Delegate Commander Ori Veth of the Sarathi Enforcement Division. She was using the formal conclave address mode, which by convention required a response. I was not going to give her one, but I had left something else. In the communications relay on Earth's surface, an old broadcast tower, one of the first ones humanity had built after first contact, standing in a field outside of Geneva, I had installed a looping transmission before we left. It had been broadcasting for 3 hours already. It was a video feed, a simple one, a fixed camera angle, good lighting, clean background, and in front of the camera, my sister Maya, sitting in her studio in Lagos, her hands moving. She was signing. 2 words. Slowly, clearly, with the particular deliberateness she brought to work she wanted people to understand. We decided. Over and over. Calm and certain and perfectly formed. We decided. The fleet commander would not have known what it meant immediately. Her translation systems would have flagged the visual communication and begun analysis. It would have taken several minutes, maybe longer. I hoped she watched it while she waited for the translation. I hoped she watched Maya's hands moving with the steady confidence of someone saying something that had been decided fully, by everyone, without reservation or regret. The Constants moved into formation with the rest of the fleet. Around me, through the viewports and on the displays, I could see the other ships moving, the enormous habitat vessels, the agricultural platforms, the medical ships, the research craft. 2,417 vessels, named for human beings who had made things that mattered. Priya's voice came through the ship-wide channel from her position on the lead vessel. All ships, perihelion is active. We are on final approach to fold coordinates. Stand by. I went to the main viewport. I looked at Earth. It was very beautiful from here. It was always very beautiful from here. Green and blue and white, with the cloud systems moving across its face in slow spirals, and the light from our sun catching the ocean surfaces in long, bright bands. I looked at it for exactly as long as I wanted to. Then the fold opened ahead of the fleet. It was not what I had expected. I had imagined something dramatic, a tear in space, a distortion, a visual event that matched the scale of what we were doing. It was quieter than that, a deepening in the space ahead of us, a place where the light bent slightly inward, a sense of a door that was not quite like a door, but was the closest word available. The lead vessels entered first, then the middle of the fleet, then the ships at the rear, including the Constants. I watched the Milky Way through the viewport as we crossed the threshold. For a moment that felt longer than a moment. I could see the whole shape of it, the full spiral, the long arms, the dense, brilliant center. I had seen images of it my whole life. You cannot see the shape of something from inside it. You have to leave to see it. Then we were through. The other side was dark in a way that had a different quality than any dark I had experienced before. Not empty. The instruments immediately began detecting structures and signals and the far faint light of other galaxies, but deep. A dark that had scale to it. The Milky Way was behind us now. On the viewport display, it appeared as a smear of light, fading slowly as we moved further into the intergalactic space. I stood at the viewport for a long time. Eventually, I opened my journal. I had not written anything in it for 3 days. I uncapped my pen, an old habit, paper and ink. I had kept it since childhood, and I looked at the blank page. I wrote, "We left. We are whole. We are all here. That is enough for now." Then I closed the journal, and I looked out at the dark, and for the first time in 8 months I was not afraid, and for the first time in 3 years I was not angry, and the thing I felt instead did not have a common name. It was the feeling of having done exactly what you meant to do. 11 years later, the signal came from the Milky Way. I almost did not hear it at first, not because it was faint. It came through on a frequency that our monitoring systems flagged at the highest priority level, but because I was in the middle of something, and my mind was elsewhere. I was standing in the central hall of Perihelion Station, which we had built in the space between galaxies, a structure that would have been impossible to imagine building 11 years ago, and which now served as the administrative and diplomatic hub of the Perihelion Reach. I was watching the morning arrivals from the outer settlements come in through the station's transit hub, which I did sometimes when I had a clear hour, because I liked watching people move through a space that had been designed for all of them. An aide touched my arm and told me a priority signal had arrived. I went to the communications center and read the origin code. It was Chorathi, the same species whose delegates had looked like beings carrying something heavy, 200 years of grief in the shape of their bodies. The message was long and carefully worded, and it had clearly been written by someone who understood that I would be reading it with a very specific kind of attention. The quorum of efficiency had fractured, not all at once. Over the 11 years since our departure, a series of internal pressures had built up within the conclave that the quorum had not managed well. 4 species had been expelled from the quorum block for asking inconvenient questions. 3 others had left voluntarily. The empty seat that Earth had left in the conclave chamber, the physical seat, the actual chair at the end of the first ring, had become a quiet symbol. The conclave administrative staff had tried twice to remove it and assign it to another species. Both times the motions had failed. The chair stayed empty. A few species had begun placing small objects on it during sessions. Nothing formal, just objects. A stone, a pressed plant from a home world, a piece of carved material that meant something in a specific cultural context. The Chorathi message said that a reform coalition was now large enough to force procedural changes in the conclave. The Veth Collective had come out publicly about their genetic variance statistics, which had caused a significant internal debate that was still ongoing. The species with no agreed name, designation 7 Hive, had been granted full membership with a modified communication accommodation that several other conclave members had helped design. That particular development had made Marin, the Veth delegate, send me a separate brief message that simply said, "You were right about listening." And at the end of the Chorathi message, carefully phrased, respectful, and clearly anxious about how it would be received, was the question: would humanity consider returning? I read the message twice. Then I sat with it for a day without telling anyone. Not because I was uncertain about my own feelings, but because my feelings were not the ones that mattered. I had learned that over the past 11 years more thoroughly than I had learned almost anything else. I had come from a world where diplomatic decisions were made by small groups of people acting on behalf of many. I now lived in a community where the decision-making looked different, and I had come to believe that the way a decision is made is not separate from the decision itself. The process is part of the answer. I brought the message to the Reach Council. The council heard it and voted to put the question to the whole population. Not just the council, not just the elected representatives, everyone. Every person in the perihelion reach, across 11 years of settlement and growth, and the building of something that had not existed before, was asked the same question the Chorathi had asked us. The vote took 3 days. It was organized the same way we had organized the assembly vote 11 years ago, with the same kind of careful attention to accessibility and inclusion. Every format, every language, every communication mode, every way of saying yes or no or not yet accounted for. I voted on the second day, from my office at Perihelion Station, on a simple interface that asked me to register my preference from 5 options. The results came back on the morning of the 4th day. 71% had voted not yet. 18% had voted not unless the conditions are fully met. 11% had voted yes, on our terms. 0% had voted for unconditional return. We compiled the response accordingly. I drafted the reply myself. I sat at my desk with my journal open beside me, not to copy from it, but because I had always written better when the journal was open, even if I was not writing in it. The reply was formal but not cold. It was direct but not aggressive. It acknowledged the Chorathi message, recognized the genuine changes described in it, and stated clearly that humanity's consideration of any return to the Galactic Conclave was contingent on a specific set of principles that we were enclosing. There were 11 principles. I had written the first draft and then sent it to the council, which had sent it to a working group, which had spent 3 weeks refining it through the kind of careful, slow, thorough process that tends to produce things that last. The final version was shorter than my draft and better than my draft, which was as it should be. The first principle said, no member species, institution, or body within the Galactic Conclave may define the right of any being to exist on the basis of economic output, productivity metrics, or any framework derived from such measures. The other 10 built from that. I wrote the transmission in 4 languages: English, Yoruba, ASL notation, because there were deaf humans in the Reach who had contributed to these 11 principles and whose communication forms belonged in the answer as much as anyone else's, and Priya's private math shorthand, which she had developed as a teenager to take faster notes in class, and which had evolved over the years into a complete symbolic language that her team used for complex systems notation. Priya had asked me years ago not to make a big thing out of her contributions to any of this. I had agreed. Then I had put her shorthand in the formal transmission to the Galactic Conclave, and technically kept my word. I sent the transmission on a Thursday morning. After I sent it, I went to the central hall of Perihelion Station, not because I had business there, but because I wanted to walk through it. I did that sometimes. It was a large space with high ceilings designed to accommodate multiple types of movement. Walking, wheeling, the motion patterns of visitors from the Veth Collective, who sometimes came through the station and moved in their quick, shifting way that the humans had learned to navigate around with the easy adjustment of people living alongside difference. The light was set to the morning cycle, which was warm and angled. The transit hub was busy at this hour, and the noise was the particular layered kind that comes from many people moving through a space with purpose. I walked through it slowly. Then I went to the east wing of the station, where Maya's sculpture was installed in the open plaza at the center of the habitation ring. She had built it over the course of the first 2 years after our arrival. It was large enough that you could walk around it and through it, which was intentional. It was made from materials she had brought with her, and materials she had found in the Reach, metals and stone composites, and one particular element she had discovered on the second planetary survey that had a translucence she had spent 6 months figuring out how to work with. It had no title, or rather its title was a shape she had made with her hands when people asked, a gesture that no translation system had ever successfully rendered in text. What the sculpture depicted was not easy to summarize. That was intentional too. Maya had always said that if you could summarize a sculpture in a sentence, someone had made a mistake somewhere. But what I saw in it, when I walked through it and around it, and looked at it in different light at different times of day, was people moving, figures in motion, not triumphant motion, not the raised fist, chest-forward motion of statues that want you to know they won something, just moving, walking, rolling, being carried, leaning, stepping, all of them in the middle of a step rather than at the end of one, all of them going somewhere. And in the section of the sculpture nearest to the main entrance, there were 2 figures I always came back to. Small, relative to the others. Indistinct in terms of specific features. One was leaning very slightly toward the other. They were both mid-step. Neither one was behind. I stood in front of those 2 figures for a while. Then I sat down on the bench that the plaza maintenance team had placed nearby for people who wanted to spend time with the work. I opened my journal to a new page. I thought about the Chorathi message, about the fractured quorum, about the empty chair with its small offerings, about Marin's message, and the species called Designation 7 Hive being given a seat at a table that had once only considered them a communication problem, about the 46 species that had voted correctly 11 years ago and had stayed in the conclave to push for something better. I thought about what it had cost to leave. Not in the dramatic sense. The leaving had been difficult, but we had been ready for it. I mean the smaller cost. The cost of turning your back on a community you had joined in good faith. The grief of that. The uncertainty. The years of building something from nothing in the dark between galaxies, knowing that what you were building had never been built before, and there was no guide for it. We had built it anyway. I thought about what it would mean to go back. Not in the concrete policy sense. The 11 principles covered that, and the council had that work in hand. I mean what it would mean as a feeling, to walk back into that chamber, which I could still see exactly when I closed my eyes. The spiral shape, the pressurized booths, the liquid pods, the shifting light, and to sit there again, to look at the gray seats. I thought that if we went back, we would go back as something different than what we had been when we left. Not better in every way. 11 years of building something new had taught me that there were things about the old world that I had not fully valued while I was in it, but different in ways that mattered. We knew, now, what we were capable of when we decided together. We knew what we were willing to leave for, and what we were willing to build from nothing. We had 11 years of proof that a civilization organized around the principle that every life has worth regardless of productivity does not collapse. It expands. It creates things it could not have imagined. It sends probes beyond the edge of the galaxy, and it builds sculptures in the dark, and it votes on things carefully, and it takes care of its people. The galaxy had once voted to end the lives of people like my sister, people like Priya, people like George Nkosi and Faye Okonkwo, and Liam Draper, and Colonel Diane Marsh, and every other human being who had been counted as a deficit by someone else's formula. We had voted instead to leave. And now, 11 years later, the galaxy was asking if we would come back. We had told them, not yet, and maybe, and if you meet these conditions, then yes, on our terms. That was the right answer. It was the most human answer I could imagine. Not a clean yes, not a permanent no, but a considered response that held the door open without walking through it yet. That left the power in our hands while leaving the conversation open. That said, we are watching, and we remember what happened, and we are not in a hurry, and we will decide when we are ready. I wrote in my journal, they asked if we would come back. We told them we would consider it. That is the most human sentence I have ever written. The quiet, steady power of making someone wait for an answer they once thought they already owned. I closed the journal. The morning light in the plaza shifted slightly as the station's cycle moved forward. The two small figures in Maya's sculpture caught the light differently at this angle, mid-step, both of them, going somewhere. I sat with that for a while. Then I stood up, tucked the journal under my arm, and went back to work.